My personal journey started probably when I started to play guitar, which was the summer in between my junior and senior year of college. And I was a folky, finger-picking hippie at the time. And I had then gone to graduate school. I was working on a PhD in psychobiology. I was doing animal behavior research. And I was pretty miserable. And the more miserable I was in graduate school, the more time I spent with guitars. And I just had this very naive, romanticized fantasy that if I could learn to build guitars, that I could get out of the rat race, have my cabin in the woods, build guitars, musicians would beat a path to my door. And I did quit graduate school, and I did find an acoustic guitar maker in New Jersey who I apprenticed with. His name was Augie Laprinzi. He's still building guitars down in Clearwater, Florida. And I worked with him for a couple of years. And then I went and got completely into repair work on all guitars. I took over the repair department for a music store in Philadelphia called Medley Music, and I worked there for 5 years. And I had a customer his name is Craig Snyder, who was a top Philly studio musician, who had moved to New York, and he kept bringing his instruments to me. He kept bringing instruments of friends to me, and I asked him why, and he said, well, there's no one as good as you in New York, which I found surprising. But so I started commuting from Philly to New York every weekend, using my friend's apartment as a base, and his friends would bring over instruments. I'd bring them back to Philly, bring them back the following weekend. And I did that for 6 months until I had the confidence that I had established enough clientele that I could go on my own. And so I started my own shop in New York in September of 1979. The other thing I realized at that point was if I was going to make a living as a professional instrument maker or repair person, I needed to be where there were enough professional musicians who could afford to pay me what I thought my skills were worth. And so it really meant New York, LA, or Nashville. And given those three choices, I'm a native New Yorker. New York was the logical place for me to go. And so I set up shop primarily doing repairs and restorations. So that was 79. I started building my own guitars in 80, and I started building my own basses in 82. And there was no intentional decision to focus more on basses than guitars, but just between the players that I connected with and the voids in the marketplace at that time, the basses got a little more momentum going. My association with Marcus Miller, my association with Will Lee, with John Patitucci, that all gave me a lot of momentum on the bass side of things. But we still make guitars, and we're very proud of our guitars as well. Regarding the archtops, I had first started thinking about doing an archtop as far back as the late 80s. And I remember at a guitar makers convention discussing it with Bill Collins, actually from Collins Guitars and all of that. And there was just a feeling that I had that, which persisted through the 90s and into the first part of the new millennium, shall we say, that there was a big explosion in archtop making and archtop makers. And the whole trend over that 15-year, 20-year period was to make these archtops more and more acoustic. And so they were made with floating pickups mounted off the pickguard or off the end of the neck. And I saw a situation where, one, these instruments were ranging from $8,000 to $30,000, and I don't know too many working musicians who can A, afford one of those instruments, and B, would be willing to take it out on their local gigs. You take it, do the jazz guitar brunch gig, and some waitress drops her tray on you, and you don't want to take a $30,000 guitar to that. So essentially they were becoming collector's instruments or living room guitars or studio guitars. And then the other issue is the lighter and more acoustic they were structurally, the less well they functioned amplified. And they were much more prone to feedback problems. There were very few choices with pickups. If you've got a floating pickup mounted off the pickguard or off the end of the neck, the aftermarket for other pickups is very, very limited, and the labor to install them, since everyone has a different mounting approach, is very intensive. So I felt there was a need for, again, just my whole focus, my whole career has been on instruments for working musicians, okay? I don't build for collectors, I build for players. Whether, it's somebody who's got a day job, who plays with, in a bar band or whatever on weekends, or full-time working professionals. And so I was really obsessed with the idea of going back to a laminated construction, not only for tonal reasons, but for cost and durability in terms of flying with an instrument and all of that. And I had been taking care of Jim Hall's guitars for quite a few years. I remember once somebody stepped on his cord and broke out the side of his DeQuisto where the output jack was, and even he was getting nervous about flying and traveling with his guitar. I mean, even though his is a laminated top and back, the sides were solid on that instrument. So I told Jim what my idea was, and I said, if I could make a guitar that you would honestly play, would you be willing to get behind me on this? And he said, absolutely, not only because he was nervous flying with his guitar, but he said his students had such limited choices of instruments. He felt bad for them. So he thought it was a good idea, which was encouraging to me. We made a couple of prototypes. The first was a all 5-ply maple laminate construction, and the second one had a laminate spruce top as opposed to a laminate maple top. And the initial comparison of those was that the spruce top did sound a little louder acoustically, but through the amplified, the maple top won hands down. It was clearer, had a much higher feedback threshold. The spruce top was so much warmer that it was actually muddy sounding in comparison, and it fed back much, much quicker. So I really got committed to the laminated construction. I had explored, now making laminate tops is not an easy process for an individual maker. It requires a hydraulic press with a male and female mold at the top and the back. And the process is you take your layers of veneers with glue, and that the glue sets by heat. You put it in the press. The press has these heated plates. It squeezes the veneers together and gives it the shape, and it sets the glue at the same time. So it's not a practical thing for a small shop to be able to do this kind of process. There were companies in Germany making laminate tops that I explored, and I wasn't happy with the construction of their tops. There was one gentleman in the States who was making laminate tops, and again, they weren't what I was looking for. The only place I was able to find what I was looking for was in Japan. And fortunately, I've got very good connections in Japan. I've been doing a lot of business there since '87. And I have my Metro shop there, making our bases there. So the head of my production in Japan, he was my middleman, and we were able to start getting the instruments made in Japan. And I've been overwhelmingly pleased with what we've been doing. Again, I try to find this balance point with what I'm doing between making some more affordable instruments, but without compromising in any way my quality and what I'm all about. And so the only opportunities, the only place where I'm comfortable doing this is in Japan, because I have such an established relationship with people there who in many ways are even more demanding quality-wise than I can be at times. The Japanese consumer is the pickiest consumer in the world. If, the song is, in New York, New York, if I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. But I think it holds true for Japan. If you can make it in Japan, you can make it anywhere. The Japanese consumer is extremely, extremely picky. And in terms of, anything, any imperfections in workmanship or materials or finish. So I felt I was in very good hands with my Japanese colleagues. And so what happened is the guy who was my authorized repair guy in Japan 12 years ago came over and worked with me for a year. He left his wife and 2 little kids behind and spent a year here in New York working with me, and then went back to Japan and started up the Sadowski Tokyo shop. And at that time, he was primarily just making instruments for Japan. But about 5 years ago, I decided I wanted us to do a line that we could make there. And Japan's not an inexpensive place to manufacture. No one goes to Japan to do inexpensive stuff today. It's Korea or China, and even beyond that, you get really low end. You're talking Vietnam, Indonesia. So, and none of that interests me. I can't. Once we get to the point where we're talking about container loads and units, I check out. That's not what I'm about. But so anyway, I decided that the best way to cut costs was to reduce the options available, to just make some very basic models that represent everything I do, just offer no fancy tops, just alder bodies or ash bodies and rosewood boards or maple boards. And so just offer my most basic models with my most basic woods and no options other than choice of finish color. And that's enabled us to offer an instrument that's virtually identical to what we make here, but at about 2/3 the price. And it's been very successful. Most of my customers can't even tell the difference between an NYC Sadowski and a Metro Sadowski. I'm extremely pleased with what we've accomplished from a quality point of view. And again, it's enabled me to set up a network of very select dealers. I'm not in any supermarket type music stores. They're mostly all small, boutique-y kind of bass shops. And it's enabled us to reach out to a wider group of bassists. And the feedback we've gotten from everyone is been very gratifying. Basically, our construction process is we've gone on our New York bases to chambering all of our bodies. And by that, let me take a step back and say, historically, I've always maintained, and I was actually went in print in a magazine on this as far back as '82. I've always advocated that the solid body guitars and basses are first and foremost acoustic instruments, and that the tone of the instrument is the most important thing is the wood. Prior to that, if you think about the '70s and you think about the type of guitars that were being made there, they tended to be very heavy. Companies like Schecter were using all sorts of exotic African and South American hardwoods. They were using woods that make beautiful coffee tables, but didn't make the best guitars. And in my repair experience, I used to do a lot of modifications and upgrading of instruments. And what I noticed was that I could do the same work to two virtually identical instruments, and one would inevitably sound much better than the other. And I had to look at what was going on there. And I came to the conclusion that the better the instrument sounded acoustically, the better it sounded amplified, no matter what pickups were in it, no matter what bridge was on it. And that these instruments that sounded better acoustically tended to be the lighter weight instruments, not the heavy ones. And so I started, basically using my instincts as an acoustic guitar maker to start picking lighter, more resonant woods for my instruments. And then a few years ago, I've noticed that my instrument weights were creeping up. I always liked to build in the range of about 8.5 pounds was always my target weight for a bass, for example. And they were starting to creep 9.5 pounds, which is still light by most people's standards, but not as light as I wanted to be. And the availability of wood, of lighter wood, just wasn't there the way it had been. So I took the approach of chambering the bodies, in other words, routing out chambers inside the body as a way to reduce the weight. And then we put a matching top on the instrument. I think you can see the glue seam here. We put a matching top of the same wood, or we can do fancier tops like the spalted maple top. But so now all of our instruments are chambered and have a top either of a light wood or a contrasting, highly figured wood. So we definitely got our weights under control. And then just serendipitously, I was noticing and getting feedback from a lot of my good clients that the chambered instruments were sounding better. And so that was very gratifying side effect, but it pretty much confirms, again, what I've always felt in my gut. The limit of lightweight, though, is instrument balance. If you go too light on the body, the instrument's going to get excessively neck heavy. And so that's what keeps me from trying to go beyond. I think the only way to achieve an instrument that'll have balance in a much lighter weight is to go headless design like Steinberger, but that doesn't aesthetically appeal to me. But the that is the limiting factor in how light can go on the body, is that it'll be too neck heavy if you go too light. I mean, for example, on the archtop guitars, we put in a good 10 hours of work on each instrument before they leave our shop. On the basses, I mean, it's just part of our build process, but we will put as much time into finessing the frets and a final setup as some manufacturers can put into building an entire instrument. I'm talking offshore manufactured, but yeah, I mean, we put a tremendous amount of time in that. It's just really important when a person picks up an instrument that it just feels great from the get-go. And I understand that there are instruments in all sorts of price points, and you can have something that's the best instrument to be had for $500, and something that's the best instrument to be had for $1,000. And I understand the compromises that one makes in different price points. But for what I'm trying to do and the players I'm trying to deal with, fretwork and setup has to be spot on. There's just no excuse for anything but that. Historically, again, given my 30 years as primarily being a repairman and a setup person, I really made my reputation on my fretwork. Okay, and it's just such a fundamental aspect of an instrument that there's just no shortcuts around doing spectacular fretwork. Also requires a lot of issues that people with playability are not in the frets themselves, but in the fingerboard, how perfectly level a fingerboard is. A fingerboard needs to have a certain amount of relief from here to here. When you have a string vibrating, the string vibrates in an arc where the most vibration occurs in the middle of the vibration. A neck has to have a little bit of that in it so that it allows room for the string to vibrate without rattling against the frets. So putting in a subtle amount of relief in a fingerboard is important. Most instruments, whether they're bolt-on or set neck, at the point where the neck loses the support of the body, the neck has a tendency to want to flex right here and pull up a little. So the result is you get a little high spot here relative to here. In other words, if I were to push up hard on this neck, okay, this is where it's going to flex, and this part's going to rise up relative to that. And that's the cause of a lot of instruments fretting out in the upper register, or on guitars choking when you bend notes. So we, from about the 15th fret to the end of the fingerboard, we compensate for that by putting about 20 thousandths of an inch of what I call drop off, where this end of the fingerboard is about 20 thousandths lower than this point if you were to have a straight edge going across. All right, so those are the subtleties of truing fingerboards. And then there are fingerboard radius issues. Some instruments have more curve in a fingerboard, some instruments have less curve. There are pros and cons to different radiuses. Old Fender, vintage Fenders have a large amount of radius, 7.5 inches. So if you can imagine, radius is half the diameter of a circle. So a 7.5 inch radius would be a circle that had a 15-inch diameter. So you draw a circle with that diameter, and then you take 3 inches worth of the outside of that circle and that's the curve of the fingerboard. Okay, so that's why it's referred to as a 7.5-inch radius or a 10-inch radius or a 12-inch radius. Okay, so vintage fenders, like I say, basses and guitars have 7.5. It's a lot of curve. It's comfortable to play, especially for barring chords. Your finger naturally has a curve, but the result is, I think you can see that a bridge is curved in terms of the saddles, which basically has to reflect the curve in the fingerboard. So imagine this is a guitar, for example. If you bend an E string on a guitar to where the G string is, theoretically that string needs to be this high to play clean as opposed to this high. So necks with a lot of curve tend to choke out on bending. So one of the earlier things myself and other colleagues like mine began to do was modifying guitars with what we call a compound radius, where we would reduce the curve, and when we did refrets, we would reduce the curve in the upper register just so that they would bend and play cleaner up there. So there are fingerboard radius issues. We primarily use, our standard radius is a 12-inch radius. And only on our 4-string basses do we do a 9-inch. 9 is as close to a vintage Fender as I want to go. Okay, so we offer those two fingerboard radiuses, and guitars we do 12-inch and 9-inch as well. Reason we can't do 9 on a 5-string is the wider the board gets, the greater the difference in thickness between the middle and the edge of the fingerboard, and the edge of the fingerboard would just get much too thin with a 9-inch radius on such a wide neck. So we don't do any other radiuses on the 5 strings other than 12-inch. So that's some of the issues regarding fingerboards. Okay, fretwork. Fretwork has to be impeccable. Frets have to be seated perfectly. By seated, I mean all the way down, flush against the fingerboard, no gaps. I personally have always glued in frets. I think it's very important that there be a solid bond between the tang of the fret and the wood of the fingerboard. In my early repair days, I encountered many times where a customer would just have what appeared to be a dead spot. Okay, the frets were level, but they would play a particular string at a particular fret, and it just wasn't there. And I would discover in many cases that the fret was actually loose in that spot, and all it took was re-gluing the frets, and the note came right back. So a fret that doesn't have really solid contact with the fingerboard is not going to transmit string vibration well. So well seated, well secured, properly leveled. Okay, after frets are in, they have to be leveled so that they're all level in relation to each other. And then they have to be properly reshaped. A flat fret doesn't work very well. What ideally, and this will happen especially when you dress frets. A fret crown, in theory, is something like that. So if, let's say, you leveling the frets, you're going to shave some metal off the top, okay? If you just leave it like that, just kind of like sand them and buff them, rather than having a narrow contact point for the string, you end up having a wide contact point. Which doesn't result in a clear note, okay? And it also affects the intonation, because depending on how you're fingering it, the string could be making more contact on this part of the fret or on this part of the fret. So it's very important that frets be shaped properly, and that's called a crown or crowning. So once a fret gets level, then you have to file the sides like so, and you have to do it individually for every fret. There's no shortcut. You have to refile the sides so that by the time you're done sanding and buffing, you end up with a fret that's shaped as well as it was originally. Now, the wider the fret is, the harder that is to achieve. I don't find any advantage to jumbo frets. People have been talking, using jumbo frets for years. And I think for many people there was a misconception between height of the fret and the width of the fret. The jumbo frets were higher and wider in many cases. I think guitar players especially like a high fret because it enables them to get under the string and bend with more leverage. They can bend a note further with the same amount of energy. But up until the last 15 years, there weren't high, narrow frets. There were either narrow, low frets and high and wide jumbo frets. What's happened over the years is companies are making a much greater variety of fret wires. And the fret wire we use for both our guitars and basses is what I would, basically width-wise falls in between what traditionally was a vintage wire and what people would call a jumbo wire. Vintage Fender wire, vintage Martin wire, averaged from between 78 and 83 thousandths wide. A jumbo wire averaged between 103 and 110 thousandths wide. Our wire is about 92 thousandths wide. So we're in the middle from a width point of view. Now with fret wire height, if you go too high, you have problems too. The problems of a fret that's too high is that when you make contact with a fret, there's still room to go before you've pushed the string to the fingerboard. The string is not touching the fingerboard when you initially make contact with the fret wire. So the higher it is, the more there's room to essentially stretch the string after you've made contact, and that causes intonation and pitch deviation problems, just as a function of finger pressure. The other problem with frets being too high is they feel too bumpy as you slide up the fingerboard. Okay, so we've worked a long time to find a height compromise that we're happy with, and so our typical fret height is about 46 thousandths in height. The highest jumbo frets are 55 thousandths high. The lowest vintage frets are about 38 thousandths high. So again, we're kind of right in the middle. So we're in the middle width-wise on the extremes, and we're in the middle height-wise on the extremes. And like I say, we use the same fret wire on our guitars and our basses, and 99% of our customers are completely happy with what we use. Okay, so those are fingerboard and fret. Next issue is nuts. Okay. A nut needs to do a couple of things. It needs to space the frets, space the strings evenly. It needs to be the outside strings need to be a sufficient distance from the edge of the board, otherwise you can easily slide off the edge of the fingerboard if the outside strings are cut too close to the edge of the fret. So first step is to lay out the outside strings so that they lay properly, and then to lay out the spacing so all the other strings lay out appropriately. Then the next issue is cutting them to the right depth. In all my years of doing guitar work, I have never been able to come up with a quantifiable measurement for nut height, where you can stick something under a string and measure it. We do it strictly by feel. And there's a very fine line just 1 or 2 file cuts between a string being right and being too low. The problem with a nut slot that's too low is you're going to get buzzing on the open string. The nut only affects the open string, and that's something I want to clear up. A lot of people have misconceptions. Back in the 70s, everyone was putting on brass nuts for better sustain. The nut only affects the sound of the open string. The second you fret the string, the nut has nothing to do with what's going on, okay? So anything related to the nut is an open string issue. Other than a feel thing, in the sense that if a nut is too high, it's going to make the whole first position too stiff. And it'll also throw off your intonation in the first position, because the more you have to stretch the string to reach the fret, the more you're going to drive your note sharp. So in a nutshell, no pun intended, a nut needs to be as low as possible, but still accommodate the reality that a player plays with a certain attack on the open string, and it needs to allow that person. So it's very attack dependent. Somebody who plays with a very light touch can tolerate a much lower nut than somebody who really digs in hard. But the compromise is, until you're in a position where you can tweak it for a specific customer, you have to essentially choose a medium ground on a nut, because you just don't know how high or light that individual is going to play. But again, the key things are properly laying out the outside string so you're not too close to the edge of the fingerboard, evenly spacing the strings, and then bringing them down to the proper nut heights. Nut slots have to be cut at an angle at least equal to the angle between the string and the tuning machine. Essentially, I'm exaggerating, but a nut slot needs to be cut on an angle like so. If the nut slot's too flat, you're also going to get buzzing directly from the nut slot itself. So that's nut issues. Nut materials, like I said, nut only affects the open string. Brass grabs the string and, in my opinion, causes a great deal of tuning problems, especially on guitars. I haven't put a brass nut on an instrument since 1980, maybe. So the main materials are today, natural materials are bone and ivory. Ivory has always been the traditional material. Bone is very, very close and more politically correct. And then there are synthetic materials. There's a material called micarta, and there's a variety of materials made by companies like Graphtec and others. So there's synthetics, bone and ivory. Those are the main nut materials. Now, going to the bridge point, as I mentioned when we talked about the fingerboard radius, a bridge has to mimic the radius of the fingerboard. So when I set up a bridge, the process that I use is I measure the string of the 12th fret from the underside of the string to the top of the fret. Okay, this is where I measure. But to take the nut out of the equation, I hold the string down at the first fret when I measure. You can see how much difference just from fingering at the nut. You can certainly see the string moving here. Okay, and so you just want to remove that as a variable. So that's why I hold the string down at the first fret. You need a good ruler, graduated in 30 seconds or millimeters. Okay, and I measure from the top of the fret to the underside of the string. Okay, and there are no absolutes here because, again, players vary on how hard they play. A player with a light touch can take a lower action than a player with a heavy touch. If I'm going to give ranges of specs on a bass, well, I'll give you our middle of the road spec, which is where we go, and then we can either take things a little lower or a little higher depending on the individual. But for a bass at the G string, at the 12th fret, we're talking essentially just a hair over 2/32 of an inch, okay? And for an E string, we're talking 3/32 of an inch. And then for a B string, probably, I would say, 7/64 of an inch, okay? And those are your basic action specs on a bass. On an electric guitar, 3/64 to 2/32 on a high E string, and about 5/64 on the low E string. And again, in addition to maintaining the radius, there's also the physics that this string is going to vibrate much more than this string. So in addition to maintaining the radius, you have to do a slight gradual increase. This string's going to need to be a little bit higher off the fingerboard than this one. And so it's kind of like a ladder, where this string needs to be a smidgen higher than this needs to be a teeny bit higher than this needs to be a teeny bit higher than that, this needs to be a teeny bit higher than that. But the overall range from this string to this string is rarely more than a 32nd of an inch, okay? So those are the action factors. And then the next factor is intonation, which is a function of back and forth travel on the saddles. I find it impossible to intonate an instrument on a traditional tuner that's just used for tuning, like the needle tuners, for example. They just don't give us enough accuracy. We use strobe tuners, either the traditional Kahn-Peterson strobe type tuners or the newer Peterson digital strobe tuners, like that one there. But we only use strobe tuners. And the process of intonating an instrument is pretty straight ahead. I like to hold an instrument in the same position I'm playing it in. And the process is to tune the instrument at the 12th fret, either fretted or at the harmonic, and then play the fretted instrument. I'm sorry, I meant open or the harmonic. So you want to tune the open string or the 12th fret harmonic, and then you want to play the instrument at the 12th fret. If the 12th fret is sharp, you need to bring your saddle back to flatten it. If the 12th fret is flat relative to the open string, you need to bring the saddle front to make it sharper. So it's just this trial and error process. You play the open string, you play the fretted string, you adjust the saddle, then you have to retune again the open string, okay, and then you tune to the open string, play the fretted string, and you keep making your adjustments until you're there. Now again, finger pressure is going to affect that. You squeeze really hard, it's going to read sharper. So you want to be conscious to play it with what would be a normal pressure for yourself. And again, the subtleties of this kind of stuff is you'll get one reading with your first finger, and you'll get a different reading with your second finger because the size of your fingertip is different. Everything, exactly how close or far from the fret. So what I'm trying to convey is you just want to play the fretted note with as close to a normal finger pressure as you would do if you were playing normally. And that handles the intonation. And then the last step in the whole process is setting pickup heights correctly. With Fender-style pickups especially, the pole pieces are the magnets. I mean, you can just see it grab my ruler as I get it just sucks it down. These are the actual magnets. In a humbucking style pickup, the magnets are much further down in the pickup and they're not as strong. So what happens on Fenders and Fender style instruments is if the pickups are too close to the strings, the magnetic field literally disturbs the string's normal vibration. In order to generate sound, an electric guitar string has to have magnetic properties. It has to be a metal that a magnet will attract. And what happens is the pickup creates a magnetic field around a coil, and when the string vibrates, it disturbs that magnetic field, and that's what generates millivolts, and that's what the energy that becomes your signal. So, but again, if the magnets are too close, they cause the string to vibrate falsely, and that results in either what I call double tones. It almost sounds like you're getting two different notes when you pluck the string, or it totally throws off your intonation as you go in the upper register. For Fender style pickups, whether it be a Strat pickup or a jazz bass pickup, I like to, again, hold the string down at the last fret to get that out of the equation. And again, compensating for string thickness, I set the bass sides a little lower than the treble side, but I like to go for about 3/32 of an inch between the string and the pull piece on the highest treble string, and about 1/8 of an inch on the bass side. And that maintains a good distance in terms of not having the magnets interfere with the string vibration. And I think that really covers the basic variables in terms of what goes into a good setup and having an instrument play properly. I don't envy the position of a music store in the sense that, if you've got 100 instruments hanging on the wall and you've got temperature changes and humidity changes, you've got all sorts of people with all different acidity from their hands, it's not an easy task to maintain instruments to be set up properly. Even in our small showroom, it takes quite a bit of effort to make sure that everything is optimally set up as possible. So, I think a lot of what separates a really great music shop from another is how much time they devote to maintaining the instruments that they have in stock. I think the Sadowski sound has been defined not by me, but by a lot of other people as a Fender on steroids, okay? And, I'd like to spend a minute just to explain why my instruments are so Fender-like, okay? When I started in New York in '79, if you got the book from the union, which is the New York Musicians Union, they have all the musicians listed by the instrument they play. So you'll have a trumpet section, you'll have a trombone section, you'll have a drum section. The bass section had two categories. It had upright bass and it had Fender bass. Fender bass was electric bass in those days. And I noticed early on that there was a very strong prejudice by engineers and arrangers to musicians coming to sessions with basses other than Fender, either a jazz bass or a precision bass. And the reason for that is most of the session work was what was called jingle work. They were radio commercials, TV commercials. They were 40-minute studio bookings. Get them in, get them out. It had to be done with a certain amount of efficiency. And an engineer did not want to see somebody walk in with a guitar or bass that they were unfamiliar with and first have to spend 10 or 15 minutes dialing in a good sound for that instrument. They knew how to EQ a jazz bass or a P bass. They knew how to record a Strat, a Tele, a Les Paul, and a 335. And with few exceptions, if you went to sessions with anything other than that, you probably weren't going to get called back. So I realized that pretty early on, and so I knew that if I was going to have my instruments gain acceptance, that they had to be Fender style to avoid this issue. Well, they could have been Gibson style too, but there were no Gibson basses in the studios, so in order to gain the acceptance not only from the players but from the engineers, I realized I needed to make a Fender style instrument. So that is why my instruments are so Fender-like. But I also happen to think that Leo Fender, whether it's serendipity or brilliance, really, really nailed some very, very time-tested classic designs from the get-go. And it's really been, other than materials and workmanship issues, it's really been hard to improve dramatically on Leo's original design. But what made what gave me a foot in the door is I was very early to adopt active electronics in basses. Guitar players don't benefit as much from active electronics. You know, all you need is a great sounding guitar and a great sounding amp, and you're fine. Bass players traditionally always had trouble cutting through in the mix. The bass would get lost in the mix and tend to be muddy and not defined. And so I had some very good friends back in the 70s who were like ex-Alembic guys out in San Francisco. They formed a company, a short-lived company called Stars Guitars, and they were making guitar preamps, bass preamps. And so I remember having a session guy named Tony Kniff come to me around 1979, and he was just looking for that elusive, what can I do to get my bass to sound better? And everything else was there. It was a good P bass. And I said, well, you know, why don't we try a preamp? So we installed the Stars preamp, which was just an active treble and bass boost. And he was just absolutely thrilled with the result of this. And shortly thereafter, Marcus Miller came to me in a similar situation. He was 19 years old. He was starting to get busy doing some sessions. He brought me his 77 Fender, and he said, what can we do to make this as good as we can? And I suggested we retrue the fingerboard and refret it. I suggested we put a better bridge on it. I suggested we shield the electronics to eliminate excessive hum problem, and I suggested we try a preamp. And he gave me the go-ahead, and I completely reworked his bass. And in many ways, the rest is history. I mean, I'm so closely identified with Marcus in that regard. The effects of the preamp were just perfectly matched for Marcus's sound. My circuit, so the first circuit was a Stars Guitars circuit. They went out of business by around 81, and I switched over to a Bartolini preamp, which came the closest to what the Stars was. That it was just a treble and bass boost control, no cut, no mid-range. Marcus's Stars circuit burned out in a couple of years, and I replaced it with the TCT. And I used the TCT throughout the 80s, but by 1990, I wanted at that time to do my outboard preamp box, and I didn't feel that Bartolini could supply me as efficiently as I needed at that point, so I went ahead and did my own circuit at that point. Alex Aguilar was a good friend of mine, and he definitely helped me with the design of the preamp. He made numerous prototypes for us, and we kept telling him what we wanted it to sound like, and eventually he came up with something that we were totally happy with, and that's been our preamp ever since 1990. And again, treble boost, bass boost. The effect of our preamp is there are two wide bands of boost for the treble and the bass. The frequency centers are 40 hertz on the bass, 4K on the treble. Where they don't overlap is right around 300 hertz, your lower mids. So the effect is, if you're going to boost treble and bass and nothing's happening in the mids, you're basically attenuating the mids by default. And what that does is produce a sound that's scooped in the lower mids and is very tight with a lot of definition. And so I think it's that which has really contributed to people saying how well my instruments cut through, either live or in the studio. Boosting mids sounds great to the player. It makes you sound really thick and fat, and it sounds great in your monitor when you're on stage. But the truth is, in my opinion, and that's all it is, I feel that by boosting mids, you make your bass sound muddier, and you work against the ability of the bass to sit well in the mix. Okay, so almost all the other bass builders and bass preamps have mid circuits and also have cut and boost controls, but I've been never felt the need to change what we're doing preamp wise. Anything that Will has done, Will Lee, he's on a sideman on an infinite number of records, and you can go to willlee.com and get his discography, plus his solo albums. I also remember, ever since the 80s, people telling me how amazing Will's bass sound is on the Letterman show, and I always wondered how people listening through a speaker this size in their TV could even tell how good, but the feedback was always there. Oh, I've never heard a better sounding bass on TV. Marcus too, anything Marcus has done. Now Marcus still has the TCT in his main Fender. He has many basses that I've made for him that all have the Sadowski circuit. But, I don't have like a definitive cut from a specific player that I would suggest anybody listen to. I think anybody can go to the artist page on my website, look at the people playing our instruments, and know what they're hearing. So, but there's no question. I think if I had to name two bassists that have people mostly associate with me and my sound, it's Will and Marcus.